Hi everyone, welcome back to another Overwatch analysis video. I am your host, Jeff, and today we're going to be talking about the kind of middle pack Western teams in the Overwatch League. You know, your Dallas Fuel, your Houston Outlaws, San Francisco Shock, Philly Fusion, or Florida Mayhem. These teams all had varying results from week one. Of course, Dallas Fuel, for example, looked really good in their match, in their first couple maps at least, against Seoul Dynasty. Philly Fusion looked pretty average throughout their games. I mean, they definitely won both, but they didn't. They went 1-1. They lost against the Spitfire. But they did pretty well. They didn't look bad for sure. And then you had teams like Florida Mayhem and San Francisco Shock who were just completely underwhelming. Didn't really enjoy what I saw from them at all. But across all of these teams, they kind of have the same tendencies, and so I'm going to kind of try and break these down and show them all to you today. The first thing I just kind of wanted to talk about was the lack of coordination between the DPS players and the tank players on all of these teams. It was really disconcerting to see that some of these rosters that have been around for a long time and have done really well, like Dallas Fuel, just had a lot of struggles keeping their DPS players and their tank players on the same page. Whenever a team engages in a professional Overwatch game, usually it looks a little bit like this. Your tanks go in first. Your Winston jumps in. Your Reinhardt gets speed boosted in by a Lucio. And they kind of take aggro, right? They kind of create some space. And then the DPS players follow in immediately afterwards onto priority targets while the enemy team is in disarray. Now, the other tank, the off tank, is usually there to support the main tank. He'll, like in the case of right now with Winston and D.Va, Winston will jump in with D.Va following with the defense matrix over the Winston, and then the Winston will drop his bubble. Both the Winston and the D.Va will focus the target, and as soon as the bubble runs out, D.Va will pop the matrix again over the Winston to keep them both alive. And while this is all happening, of course, you have Tracer and Genji following up, hitting priority targets, and they're all trying to focus down someone in particular. That's how an engage should work in a professional Overwatch game. And it's not always that simple, but that's the basic idea. One of the consistent stories I was seeing in the games this week from the Western teams was the tanks would go in too early, the DPS wouldn't be in position to follow up, and the DPS would die because the tanks would have to back out early. That's not an ideal situation. Good example of this was from the Dorado map of Philly Fusion versus Houston Outlaws. Philly Fusion was trying to push the second point, and Houston Outlaws had all grouped up on the stairwell on the right side of the payload. And so Shadowburn had his Genji ultimate, and he was looking for an opportunity to go in with that. He was going on kind of a long flank to try and find the supports. And so the tanks go in. Neither Carpe nor Shadowburn actually went in at the same time as the tanks. So the tanks both went in, Fraggy and Poco. They got in there. They were causing a lot of disarray. And then the Winston shield got popped, and so they backed out. And when that happened, Carpe went in, got completely wrecked. I don't think he actually died. He just had to back off. And then Shadowburn went in and died. He didn't use his ultimate, though. So it wasn't a total horrible thing. But it's that kind of timing errors. Like, you have to know when your DPS is ready to go before you make the move, before you make the call. One of the issues with that is it's just incredible to me that some of these rosters that have been together for so long are still struggling with that. But that kind of goes into my next point, where these teams kind of struggle with adapting to the enemy strategy. We've seen a lot of adaptability and composition from the Western teams. In fact, I think some of the Western teams had the most flexible rosters in terms of what heroes they can actually run. Dallas Fuel, for example, has a ton of flexibility on their team. You know, Taimu can flex onto so many different heroes. He can play the Widowmaker, he can play the McCree, he can play the Soldier, he can play the Roadhog. You know, you have Harry Hook who can play the Soldier, you have Harry Hook who can play the Lucio or the Moira or the Zenyatta. You have all these different flexible hero or players on the Dallas Fuel roster, but their underlying strategy seems to be the same no matter who they're facing, no matter what's going on. they always try to focus on getting Effect into a position where he can just go off and carry the game. And that's worked pretty well for them in general because Effect is really good and they haven't had issues. But now we're seeing teams that they're not going to get completely destroyed by a Tracer if they know what they're doing. You know, Soul Dynasty can stop Effect from running hog wild on their backline. Their tanks know how to keep their supports alive. Their supports know how to keep their DPS alive. And so it's impossible at this point for Dallas Fuel to really keep climbing any higher with their exact same strategy. And so they have to show some adaptability. They have to know how to use the other DPS players on their team. They have to know how to use their tank players on their team to coordinate with their DPS so that they can find out and separate these priority targets from the enemy team. And this is what we see with every single kind of middle tier roster right now from the Western teams is they just play the same style, and that's really frustrating to see. Whereas teams like LA Valiant, Boston Uprising, LA Gladiators, while they do have their carry players, you know, and for some reason it's always their Tracer player too, because I guess Tracer's OP or something. But and on LA Valiant, you have Soon. On Boston Uprising, you have Striker. These are clutch players, but they don't have to rely on them to carry the games for them on their own individual skill. They have solid strategies. They are able to adapt. When Striker gets stuffed by a diva and doesn't get that sick pulse bomb stick, Casper is still focusing the backline. He's still getting picks. He's still putting tons of pressure out. You know, these teams, they have a multitude of different ways that they can approach a game. And unfortunately, the other Western teams, they kind of seem to rely on their individual skill. And because of that, they're not really good at setting up actual strategies. What they rely on instead is making these quick engages, forcing team fights, trying to keep the enemy on the back foot, and by always forcing a skirmish. And they're really scrappy. You see this a lot. Well, we saw this a lot in Houston versus Philadelphia. We saw this a lot in Dallas Fuel versus Soul Dynasty, where they were always trying to force a fight. They were never setting up really any interesting plays. They were setting up really basic plays, and then trying to force a team fight off of that, trying to get a clean engage. And the problem with that kind of style is the Korean teams, they know how to team fight really well. They're not going to let themselves get snowballed on. They're not going like they might lose one engage here and there, but they're not going to lose one engage and then lose the next one and lose the next one after that. They know how to regroup, reset a team fight. And that's one thing that the other Western teams hasn't figured out. If Dallas Fuel loses a point, it's far more likely that they'll get snowballed on, that someone will get picked off on their retreat, on their reset. And that's just a really unfortunate trend. And I can only imagine that it's a communication issue where teams aren't on the West don't really have experience with running from a team fight and then re-engaging when they have the numbers again. And I can't tell you why that is. I'm just noticing a trend here. It's really unfortunate that this is the case of the Western teams right now. I think that all of the Western teams have insane talent. I don't think there's a single Western team in Overwatch League right now that isn't as talented individually as the top Korean teams. Now, obviously, you have standout players on NYXL like Jonak or Sabiobi. You know, you have Fleta from Soul Dynasty, who's amazing. And on the Spitfire, you have like Prophet or Birdring, Hureg, you know, Rascal. These guys are all super, super nutty. But there's not a single Western team that can't compete with that in terms of individual skill. The problem is that these Korean teams are just on another level with their coordination and with their teamwork, and the only Western teams that are even getting close to that level are LA Valiant and Boston Uprising. They have these really strong coordination, especially Boston Uprising, who I was really, really impressed with this week, even though they lost against NYXL. I thought they showed something that none of the other Western teams showed, and that was the ability to come up with strategies on the fly that counter the other team, and that was really really fun to watch. I'd say if you want to see this clearly, go watch Horizon Lunar Colony or go watch Ilios, even though NYXL got completely destroyed on Ilios. And I mean, I think that's all that I really have to say. It's just the Western teams need to keep improving. They need to keep working on their coordination. If they can do that, I think we'll have a much more competitive next half of the Overwatch League. I'm really excited to see what we can see in the future. And of course, it was only week 1. These trends have very little sample size backing them. Might have been an off week for some of these teams, especially like the Dallas Fuel. I could see them bouncing back very easily and taking control over the next couple weeks. Other than that, though, guys, I appreciate you watching. If you'd like to see more, you can check out the rest of my channel. Thank you, and have an awesome day.